All right. So my name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined once again by Victor and Ethan of Academic Edgelords. Also, in Victor's case, of PillPod. Ethan's probably doing stuff. Who knows?
Is it still confronting capital?
Yeah, I'm working on not to turn this like into an ad. I'm working on creating the thing is I have like 5 videos that are all pretty long that I've been working on for like a really long time. So but I think like soon I'll be back in the swing of making things regularly.
Nice.
Yeah.
And will it be under the name of Confronting Capital?
Yeah, well, I wanted to do I want to start like a podcast, the main purpose of which is to kind of just like explain and discuss kind of like analytic Marxist but more broadly just like modern analytic leftist like thinkers and ideas, like G.A. Cohen, Noam Chomsky, etc.
Cool.
And I'm thinking the name that I decided on for that podcast is the September Sessions.
Okay.
Nice. From the September group.
Nice.
So yeah, that'll be fun once I finally start making it.
Sounds like that's something Ben should come on to one day.
Sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Very happily. Cool. Well, so we are going to watch today the Munk debate.
Another one of the Munk debates. This will be our third, right?
What were the other two?
Wait, maybe we only did one. We did
one on the media, right? With like Matt Taibbi.
Yeah, like the media is like a threat to free speech or something like that. Didn't we? I don't know why I thought. Did we do one on? Maybe we only did the one. I don't know why I thought we did two.
Yeah, it's possible. I just don't remember that one. I just don't remember what the other one would be. Yeah, I actually did a. So obviously it wasn't like the real thing, like in person and all that stuff. But I did a debate on the Munk Debates podcast back in the spring with Jamie Kirchick about the campus encampments. And then like right after that, they were announcing this. And I was like, oh man, this sounds like so much more fun. I should have, wish I could have done this, right?
Who's the guy who does the podcast? Is it the same dude who hosts these or is it some other dude?
I am not sure, honestly. It's been too long since we watched however many of these we watched for me to remember. Maybe I'll be able to tell you in a minute.
Yeah, when you see him, when you see him come up, maybe I'll be like, yeah, that's the guy. Did we do one on Ukraine? Or did I just go see that one in person? Maybe I just went to go see that one. I think you just
went to see that in person.
Yeah,
I don't think we've done it.
Like Mearsheimer was on that one, and it was like, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I've done a couple of Ukraine things on these, but I can't recall. I think the only Ukraine one I ever did with you guys was was like the streamers, throwing shit at each other one.
Was that the Haas one? Oh man, Haas screaming at Destiny. That was pretty fun, actually.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Like screaming at the top of his lungs.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, honestly, I was thinking about this a little while ago because I just did this Palestine debate with Walter Block. And, look, Walter Block is fucking crazy in many ways, right? Like he has all kinds of like insane and evil views. But, man, I just, I'll talk to Walter Block all day, every day, in preference to like, people like Haas and Destiny. Like,
yeah, for sure.
Actually,
he talks when it's his turn to talk. He waits while it's not. He makes an effort to address the actual arguments you just made.
Yeah, it's for sure. Actually, we were just to plug the Pill Pod a bit. When we had J-Reg, who I think we were talking about a little bit before we recorded on the Pill Pod, we actually had him on to talk about this. I don't doubt you guys have heard of it, but it's the weirdest thing. The Hegelian E-Girl Council. Have you guys heard about this?
I have heard about it. I would struggle to explain even the basics to anybody. And, just
I can't really explain it either. But like J-Reg, this other content creator in Toronto, had them on his podcast. Like he had all 4 of them at the time. And then there was drama. And like, I think there's only one of them left. And a lot of them are kind of like, I don't know, mega communists, mega communist, like esque, like kind of like, oh, synthesize everything, like horseshoe theory, like bring everything together, like through, which doesn't make any sense. And like, you know, Plastic Pills, who actually knows a lot about Hegel more than I do, was like, yeah, this doesn't make any sense, what they're talking about. But anyway, the reason I brought it up is because I think or some of them were quite friendly with Haas or something. So there's some weird connection, because like Haas is kind of in that red brown maybe space. I don't understand these like weird categorizations, and that's actually one of the fun things. Yeah,
I think that's more or less right. You know, I mean, he's one of the co-creators of the phrase "mega communism." Although what exactly? Yeah, I think him and Hasan and Hinkle, I think, are the Marx and Engels of mega communism. And yeah, I think he has a whole manifesto I skimmed once, you know, that like sort of explains what he means by it. But also my approach in my debate with Haas was to go over the actual like policy record of the Trump administration. He seemed to find that like completely irrelevant. So I don't know.
It's amazing.
But in any case, so this is on
not about that.
It's not about that. No, there's no mega communism in this debate, for better or worse. Yeah, just some like I assume that the two of them had a session with refrigerator magnets where, you know, they were like, you know, going through different phrases and seeing how it struck them and being like, okay, this one's going to trend on Twitter.
Exactly.
But yeah, no mega communism here. This is about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Is there anything we should say to set this up, or is this more or less?
Well, it's just a Munk debate. These things that happen in Toronto for a long time, and they just like have people on, and they do this like kind of cringy. I mean, maybe there's some benefits, but I feel like every time we've watched I guess the one time we watched them, I don't know why I keep thinking we watched more than one, but like we seem to complain about the format, like that the format, it's like sounds good because it's very orderly, right? They have like statements with set times. But maybe the issue is also the framing. And I believe the proposition of this debate is, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which already is just a ridiculous statement. Like, and you know, but anyway.
Yeah, I'm just kind of looking at this before. I actually just did a search of the channel for Munk debate to see if we did do a second one. I don't think we did, but it's also possible that at some point we've watched like, I know I have watched, whether or not it's been with you guys, like various like Oxford or Cambridge Union debates, which are the same kind of problem as the Munk debates. That, you know, the good thing about it is that it's structured, you know, there's like time limits, all that stuff. Huge fan of all that, right? But the bad thing about it is that these like prestige debate series are really prone to having, actually this one's not too bad. Like I mean, obviously I think the claim is asinine and ridiculous, right? But at least it's like clear what it is. Like so many of the rest of these, you know, the Munk debates, the Oxford and Cambridge Union debates, it's, you know, like I think there's this temptation that's built into the fancier debate series to have these sort of flowery debate topics that's like really unclear what they mean, and the debate ends up being horrible because, you know, people didn't really come prepared to talk about the same thing, and then oftentimes you have like way too many speakers, and, you know, like these problems all just kind of compound on each other, right? So it's not really a debate, it's like a sort of thematically linked series of speeches.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I mean, I don't
know. Resolved. The American dream is a nightmare, right?
What the fuck are you talking about? I guess this one sounds like it's clear. But I don't know. I feel like it's going to end up being like a similar situation where there's going to be a debate over semantics maybe, but then like, which is going to be high. And I think our frustration in the past with these structured debates is that like there is like an underlying like normative disagreement, but it's like they're not talking about it because they're arguing over the framing of the debate. And I think that's like possibly a problem here.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think like, yeah, it does seem like sort of, like, okay, this seems like a sort of clear proposition, but at the same time, like the clarity almost feels like deceptive, because while it is clear, it's also like the proposition just strikes me as like trivially false,
Yes,
like
exactly.
as in like, okay, like how do we prove this? How do we prove like the negation of this proposition? Okay, well, here's anti-Semitism, here's anti-Zionism, here are the definitions. Turns out they're two different words and they mean different things. Like that's the end of the debate, So like, surely there has to be something deeper to argue about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I was telling you guys before we recorded about J-Reg, who I mentioned before. I sent you guys a video of his where he does like 3 minutes to talk about how easy it is to imagine an anti-Semitic Zionist, right? That is like to show you how those two things, like anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, are not at all the same thing, because you can occupy various positions along the.
Well, and I mean, like, it's not like that's a hypothetical combination at all, right?
It's a real combination. Yeah.
I mean, Lord Balfour was pretty anti-Semitic, just to start there, right? Like,
Maybe some of these evangelicals who are excited about Israel.
Yeah, right. Totally, right? Like, so there's I think there's like actually a very long tradition of people combining those things, to one extent or another. They have, Winston Churchill, I think had a whole theory of like the good Jews and the bad Jews, where it was, that Zionism was definitely, the good Jews. Like it's not, and just on the face of it, right? Like, hey, we're going to support you guys over there is pretty obviously compatible with, we don't particularly like you over here. All right. Yeah, I mean, it's like the Klan kind of being fine with Garvey, right? Because back to Africa sounded good to them.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly why I think the position that the J-Reg video takes. He like pretends to be this anti-Semite. And he's like, wait, so you're saying they want to go to a place and stay there? Like, great.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. All right, let's get started.
I'm guessing maybe you can fast forward through some of this.
Yeah.
Outrageous, then you must think. Get our debate underway. Our debaters out here, center stage, arguing for our motion. Be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Our first debater speaking in favor of the motion is a renowned and international best-selling author of over 7 books, a war correspondent, columnist, and a former Munk debater. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Douglas Murray. Well, Douglas's debating partner tonight has come all the way from the United Kingdom to be part of this conversation. She's a celebrated attorney, an expert in international law, and legal director of the UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. Please welcome Natasha Hausdorff. Natasha. Thank you so much. Well, one great team of debaters deserves another, and here we have not disappointed. The first of our debaters speaking against the motion tonight, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, is a veteran war reporter from Israel, a correspondent, a celebrated columnist, winner of Israel's top award for journalism, the Sokolov Award. Please welcome from Tel Aviv, Gideon Levy. Thanks for making the trip. Gideon's debate partner tonight is a formidable debater in his own right. He's a former anchor at MSNBC and Al Jazeera English. He's editor-in-chief of the new digital news media platform, Zateo. Please welcome to the Munk debate stage, Mehdi Hasan. Before we go to opening statements, let's just spend a moment, a brief moment, unpacking our resolution tonight, because it's short, it's to the point, but it's also a little bit complicated. So let's try to level set on some terminology. What do we generally mean by the key words in this motion? So we're going to throw up on the screen our first definition for Zionism, conventionally defined, and I'll read it out, as the movement for self-determination and statehood for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. So I'll let you think about what anti-Zionism means in the context of that definition of Zionism. Anti-Semitism, a little bit better, I think, understood and defined. Here we have hate directed at Jewish people or cruel or unfair treatment of people because they are Jewish. That's our kind of working definition of anti-Semitism. Our debaters are going to communicate to you their own views of these terms, but let's just try to level set around these concepts when we think about how we're going to vote tonight. And that is your task now. So each of you has at your seat a voting card, an electronic pad. If you're in favor of the resolution, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you're going to press 1 on the card. It has an A beside it, 1A. If you are opposed, could you conceivably change your vote? So press 1A, and that'll keep us moving from one part of.
I've been in Israel and Gaza.
All right, Douglas Murray.
In favor.
So I think everything else we did is we skipped over his fluff.
Yeah, I agree. But look at that number.
Well, thank you very much, Rudyard. It's a great pleasure to be back.
And that'll keep us moving from one part of this debate to the next. Okay, we are ready now for the second audience vote. Change your mind, don't change your mind. Let's see those.
Oh, never mind. We didn't see the first
up
one.
on the screen now. 77.
Whatever. Let's just do Douglas Murray.
That's fine. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Rudyard. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Munk debates. When I was last here a couple of years ago, I just returned from the front line of the war in Ukraine, where I was with the Ukrainian armed forces. And for most of the last 8 months, I've been in Israel and Gaza, following the war there as closely as I can. And I won't go into all of the details now that I could give you of what's happening. But I would just put it in perspective in this way, first of all. What happened on the 7th of October was not just a massive attack on innocent people inside Israel. It was the equivalent to about 6,000 Canadians being massacred and burned in their homes in one day. It's the equivalent of about 1,500 of your fellow Canadians being taken hostage. You know, you would have thought after an attack like the one that Hamas instigated, that started this terrible war, you would have thought that there would be some sympathy for the world, from the world. You might have thought the world would pay attention to the attack and at least pay attention to the people behind it. You might have expected, like me, that there might have been a worldwide opposition to the terrorists and rapists and murderers of Hamas. You might have thought there would be hatred around the world erupting, that the government of Qatar and its mouthpiece, Al Jazeera, its funding of Hamas and its hosting of the leadership of Hamas in Qatar. You might have thought there'd have been an outpouring of rage at the Islamic revolutionary government in Tehran, but no. There was an immediate outpouring of rage against the state that had been attacked. Bring back our girls, we had 10 years ago in the war in northern Nigeria, which I also covered. Bring back our girls. No international campaign saying bring back our Jewish children. Believe all women, we've been told for years. But turns out, not if the raped women are Jews. Israel is the only country in the world which, when it's attacked, gets attacked more. You know, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is, as my late friend Jonathan Sachs said, it's a shape-shifting virus. It moves across the centuries. When you could hate people for their religion, the Jews were hated for their religion. Then you couldn't hate people for that anymore. So people hated the Jews for their race. And then after the 20th century, people realized that wasn't such a great idea either. Now the Jews are hated not for their religion or their race, but for having a state. People around the world hate them so much for it that Israelis are attacked when they have hostages taken, and this is to remember the 100 hostages still in captivity in Gaza, who, if they were given back by Hamas today, the war would be over. And they're also attacked when they rescue their hostages. You know, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is the Jews can never win, because historically they've been hated for being rich and for being poor. They've been hated for integrating and for not integrating. They were hated for being stateless. Remember, rootless cosmopolitans, the far right used to say. Now they're hated for having a state. Today, the only really acceptable form of anti-Semitism, aside from the sewers of the far right, the only real tolerated form of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. Zionism, as we just heard, is simply the right of the Jews to self-determination in their historic homeland. That's all. Anti-Semitism, as we've also just heard, is double standards against Jewish people, or cruel and unfair treatment of people because they're Jews. This isn't very far away from home here. If this isn't anti-Semitism, can the audience here tell me why the following things have happened since October the 7th? Why in a Montreal suburb a synagogue should be firebombed, as happened in November? Why there should have been gunshots against the yeshiva? Why in Toronto a bookstore owned by a Jew should be attacked? Why a Molotov cocktail was thrown through a Jewish community center in Montreal? Why a Toronto Jewish deli in North York was firebombed? Why in Toronto the Orthodox synagogue was vandalized? Why in Toronto 2 men opened fire the other week on a Jewish girls' school? If it isn't anti-Semitism, tell me why just a week ago pro-Hamas protesters tried to go through Jewish areas in this city shouting not just Allahu Akbar, but, and I quote, sorry for the language, fucking filthy fucking Zionist pigs, dirty Zionist rats. Have you heard that language before? The Jews have. Now look, if you are interested in this motion, just bear this in mind. It's not about Netanyahu, it's not about this war, it's about double standards. And one question hovers over it above all, the question of who would protect the Jews. Who would you trust to protect them? The Europeans? The Arab world? No. History shows only one people will protect the Jewish people. The Jewish people. That's what Zionism is. Thank you.
Thank you for that opening statement.
Amazing.
Yeah. Well, I definitely have some thoughts, but you guys want to go first?
I mean, it's amazing. Like Douglas Murray, he was in the other one we did though, right? Like the one about the media, he was part of that one. And I mean, it's amazing what a sophist he is. Like, it's incredible to watch him. Like he can really stir up a crowd and say stuff that has nothing to do with the proposition. and like it's like argument by insinuation, right?
Mhm.
I think that's like a very common tactic by these kinds of people, like argument by insinuation, where they say things close to each other, and then the audience is like, oh yeah, that does mean that, but doesn't actually make any sort of argument.
Yeah.
That's it's infuriating.
No, there were tons of like very strange claims and arguments there, but like I think like the one that I was most shocked by is when he was like, if anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism, then explain to me how it's not anti-Semitic to like shoot up a girls' Jewish school. It's like, what? Like clear, like surely there can be anti-Semitic crimes, even ones that are committed by anti-Zionists or anti-Semites who are also anti-Zionists. And that does not mean that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are like identical concepts, or that one necessarily implies the other.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, yeah, this is like if you said, I don't know. I mean, I literally don't even know. Like, if you said if just pick the name of a politician who's accused of being racist against some group, and you say, well, if he's not, then how come X, Y, and Z hate crimes happened against those groups? It's like, well,
yeah, it was
hold
ridiculous.
On, right? Like,
ridiculous.
Nobody's saying racism against that group doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Denying that anti-Semitism is somehow entailed by anti-Zionism, or that anti-Zionism just innately is a form of anti-Semitism. It's like in this particular hate crimes you mentioned, it's like, I don't, maybe the people who did those things were also anti-Zionist, maybe not, right? But like, even if they were, you're clearly right about that. Yeah. So the things that jumped out at me, I guess, starting with the one that might matter the most, but it might matter the least, but it still bugged me. I've noticed over the years, anytime you get somebody saying, oh, I thought we were supposed to believe all women, that's always a struggle. Nobody has ever said a combination of words earnestly. Right? People have said believe women. That was real. But the all is always the watermark of the straw man, right? Like that's like I've never once in my life heard somebody like assert as a principle that they personally believe all women. So that's just, that's a small thing. But also, while we're on that topic, of course, I don't know if this happened before. This debate was before or after the revelation about the mass rapes at Sede Taiman, but certainly puts a different light on that, right? That like anybody who's casting any doubt on any sexual assault allegations made about Hamas, clearly, is willing to doubt rape stories in one case only, and that's Jews. Whereas, now it's like, well, okay, does that same principle apply to to rape claims about Palestinian detainees about Sede Taiman? I don't know. Moving on. He said that he did a little 9/11 math, but that's how I usually think of it. That's what I remember, Crystal Ball talking about 9/11 math right after October 7th, that people were always, trying to quantify how many 9/11s October 7th, counted as.
9/11 is its own unit of measure.
Relative to the Israeli population. So this was the first Canadian version I heard of it, but it's the same principle. Yeah. And so he said October 7th was, and presumably he was, I mean, I haven't checked his math here, but presumably he was doing the equivalents for the population of Israel and Canada, that the 1,200 Israelis, including 695 civilians who were killed on October 7th, they said that would be equivalent to 6,000 Canadians being killed in one day. It's like, okay, but to Crystal's point about 9/11 math, why does this only ever apply in the one direction? So, according to an estimate in the medical journal The Lancet, the letter they published that, kind of, it's like, okay, given what we know about, the direct casualties that, are assembled by the Gaza Ministry of Health, which idiots will tell you are Hamas numbers, but actually the Ministry of Health figures, have always held up pretty well after previous wars. Seems like they're pretty scrupulous, right? When they're checked they're checked by other international organizations. And so if you start with the direct Ministry of Health numbers about Gaza, and actually I think those are probably a severe undercount, just given the destruction of medical infrastructure in Gaza, meaning that a lot of people are probably dying without being counted. But if you start out with those, do a little back the napkin math about, how many indirect deaths usually happen in wars versus direct deaths, and start thinking about the conditions in Gaza. This estimate in the Lancet said, maybe about 186,000 Palestinians have died as a result of the war, right? Which, keeping in mind, again, beyond the 40,000 or whatever up to at this point who've been directly killed, you're talking about millions of people being expelled from their homes, the complete destruction of almost all medical infrastructure. Certainly if you need insulin in Gaza, good luck with that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? People were crushed by rubble, all that stuff. So 186,000, I think, sounds pretty plausible. And 186,000 out of Gaza's pre-war population of 2.3 million is about 18.6%. So I just really quickly looked it up. 18.6% of Canada's 38 million people would be 7 million and 68,000. So if we're going to do the Douglas Murray math, that 10-7 was equivalent to 6,000 Canadians being killed, and presumably what Israel has done for the last year would be equivalent to some occupying power killing 7 million Canadians. So just, if we're going to do the math, let's do the math. And then
you're engaging way too robustly with what was not at all robust. Like, it doesn't deserve this level of takedown. Like, Douglas Murray, I was thinking about this. I think he's a smart guy. I think he knows what he's doing. Like, I think he gets up and he's like, this will, like, it's a tactic. Do you think anyway, that's off top. That's kind of off topic, but I was just like trying to think of his motivations when I was watching him. And I just don't believe he doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah. And then, of course, the shape-shifting virus thing is convenient because that's like a cute way of you personally admitting that what you're alleging really has nothing to do with any of the things that historical anti-Semitism was about, right? That's like, oh yeah, well, classical anti-Semitism is either racial or religious prejudice. This isn't that, but we're still going to count it, right? And if I list a famous person who said it, and I come up with some fun, pithy description like shape-shifting virus, I get to actually somehow make this a point in my favor that what I'm alleging has absolutely nothing to do with classic anti-Semitism. And the closest he came to engaging with the actual substance of the issue, right? Not does anti-Semitism exist, not have people been unfair or applied double standards to Israel's behavior, which obviously I don't think is true, but even if it was true, would have absolutely nothing to do with the topic, right? Like, surely if people, I'm sure that Douglas Murray believes that people are often unfair or apply double standards to U.S. military actions, right? But that's, does he think that means that people are racially prejudiced against Americans, right? Like, it's just a total non sequitur. But the one place where he actually directly engaged with the topic, whether anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism, was when he said, well, you heard it, the definition of anti-Zionism is Jewish self-determination in their historic homeland, the land of Israel. So, who could be against that, right? So that's clearly anti-Semitism. But of course, it doesn't engage at all with the reasons that anti-Zionists are against that. If Jewish self-determination means having a separatist Jewish ethno-state, especially under circumstances where you spend 57 years incorporating other lands where you don't give people their citizenship, because then you would no longer have a predominantly Jewish state, then it's that sounds benign if you use that phrase, Jewish self-determination, land of Israel. But it's look, apartheid sounds benign if you say Boer self-determination in South Africa, right? That it's people shouldn't have to lose this self-determination to be part of a larger entity that's majority black, right? You should have Boer self-determination. right? That's I mean, that would be the pretty direct equivalent. And then my last thought about this would be that his big applause line that he ended the whole thing with, because it sounds good and it sounds true, but it just doesn't make any fucking sense if you think about it for 10 seconds, was, who do you trust to protect the Jewish people? The Europeans, that, right? It's like, no, just soaring rhetoric. Like I kept thinking the whole time I was watching this, that thing, the Chris Rock thing, we have McDonald's at home, right? That like Douglas Murray is, we have Christopher Hitchens at home. Soaring rhetoric is like, no, history has shown the only people you can trust to protect the Jewish people are the Jewish people. It's like, okay, sounds good. Sounds true. Think about it for 10 seconds. Where is it safer to be Jewish, America or Israel? Western Europe or Israel? Come on. Like, on its own terms, this makes no sense.
Yeah, no, it's sort of on the point about, like you mentioned the point about double standards, and that was a weird point as well, because he seemed to kind of like gesture at an argument where he's like, oh, okay, well, anti-Semitism is just when you apply like double standards for Jews, and if anti-Zionism is just Jews get self-determination, and you oppose Jewish self-determination, by which obviously he means like a Jewish ethno-state, then you're applying double standards to Jews. But it's like, that's only true if you think that like every other racial group should have an ethno-state. But like presumably a lot of anti-Zionists don't think that,
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, presumably if when we say anti-Zionist, I mean, obviously if you're like, I don't know, like a really militant old school pan-Arab nationalist, then you're an anti-Zionist. But that's not really the kind of anti-Zionism anybody in Canada is advocating, right? Like, I mean, the same way that, sure, if you were like, if you were somebody who in like the 1950s still thought that Hitler should have won in the 1940s in Eastern Europe, then you were an anti-communist. But like, it wouldn't follow from that anti-communism is Nazism, right? And surely if the group of anti-communists you're talking about are like liberal democratic dissidents in Eastern Europe. So it's like, if what we're talking about is like secular Western anti-Zionism, then yeah, the core of that position is that nobody should have an ethno-state, that's not something that should exist in principle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree with that. I'm trying to think, was there anything, he did say, it was kind of interesting when he said like, oh, well, there was, like you'd think that after an attack of this scale, there would be this outpouring of support. There would be all this support for Israel and all of these condemnations of the attacks on the world stage, but like that didn't happen. And I mean, obviously that's not really relevant to the claim, because like, okay, even if there's a really big anti-Zionism / anti-Semitism problem in the world, that wouldn't mean that they're the same thing. But like, even the claim just like descriptively is false. I mean, like, you look at like the UN, how the UN reacted to the October 7th attacks, how like any major international human rights group reacted, like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN. Like there's not a single like major international body that sort of regularly deals with these affairs that didn't like harshly condemn the October 7th attacks. So that was kind of a weird claim as well.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I'm just so suggested by something in the comments. I was also curious about this. Okay, that's it's the like, for doing 9/11 math, I also think it's like, well, hold on, what about like really small countries, right? Like, it's like, 9/11 sounds bad, but that'll only be like 3 people in Luxembourg, I don't know what. It's a really weird game, but yeah, no, I think that's obviously correct, right? It's like when you say, "Oh, you think the world would be sympathetic," it's like, well, one, if the world means like the institutional world, it was, right? Like that, very few world leaders were not on their side, right? Coming out of that, right? I mean, certainly. Like you had tons of support for Israel, after 10/7 from leaders and political institutions around the world. It's like there's also a lot of popular outrage, but it's like, yeah, the popular, like, he's just being silly. I mean, like, this is where I guess I'd revert to Victor's point that like about it sort of not deserving better takedown, because
we've spent way more time on his opening than we really should have or needed to.
Yeah, because yeah, right. Obviously, he knows that to the extent that there was grassroots popular anger, nobody was angry at them for being attacked. They were angry at them for responding to that attack, which itself, of course, was a response to previous things Israel had done. And there's a whole cycle of attacks and counterattacks going back a very long time. But it's like, no, nobody's angry at them for being attacked. People are responding to them, but angry at them for responding to the attack by expelling millions of civilians from their homes at gunpoint and creating the world's largest population of child amputees in, like a microscopic landmass in the Gaza Strip, right? I mean, that's what they're angry about. And he obviously knows that, but I will take Victor's point and keep going.
Douglas, it's now Mehdi Hasan's opportunity to present the con side of the argument.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1917, over 100 years ago, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, a card-carrying anti-Semite, a man who had denounced the evils of Jewish immigration into the UK, a man who referred to Jews as an alien and hostile people, he issued his Balfour Declaration, which promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It was the first time a major world power had come out in favor of Zionism, which at the time was a pretty new and pretty controversial movement, calling not just for a Jewish homeland, but for the building of a Jewish majority state in Palestine. And yet the only Jewish member of the British cabinet at that time, a man named Edwin Samuel Montagu, adamantly opposed both Zionism, which he called a mischievous political creed, and the Balfour Declaration, which he referred to as anti-Semitic and a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country in the world. The only Jewish member of the British cabinet, that is what he said. And yet tonight here in Toronto, over 100 years later, we are being asked to vote for a motion that would damn Montagu as the anti-Semite while praising Balfour as the champion of Jews and Judaism. That's ridiculous. In fact, this entire motion tonight is ridiculous, disingenuous, ahistorical. It says, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It doesn't say some anti-Zionists engage in anti-Semitism, which I don't disagree with. It doesn't say some anti-Semites hide behind the cloak of anti-Zionism, which again, I don't disagree with. Everything Douglas listed about what's happened in Toronto, disgusting, reprehensible. Those people are shameless bigots. But that's not what the motion says. The motion says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. No ifs, no buts, no caveats, no exceptions. Anyone who takes an anti-Zionist position is automatically, inherently, unavoidably anti-Jewish, an anti-Semite, a racist. That is what you would be voting for if you make the mistake of voting for this motion tonight, which I'm sure you won't do because you are far too smart and nuanced an audience to do that. You are Canadians. And I have great respect for Canadians. I say that for no apparent reason whatsoever. I like Canadians. I like Israelis. My debate partner tonight, Gideon Levy, Israeli writer, is one of my journalistic heroes. It's a privilege to be on the stage with him. But this debate fundamentally at its core, and I kind of agree with Douglas here, it's not about Israelis. It's not about Israel. It's not about Gaza. And by the way, on the subject of Gaza, given Douglas gave us some math about the death toll on October the 7th, horrific death toll, which we all condemn, I would remind you also that the death toll inflicted on Gaza, the deaths and injuries in Gaza are the equivalent, if we're going to do the ratios, of 2 million Canadians. 2 million Canadians. But that's not what the debate is about. It's not even about Zionism itself. It's about the legitimacy of anti-Zionism, whether you can be anti-Zionist, opposed to Zionism, which, remember, is a political ideology, a nationalist movement, not a religion, not a race, not a protected class, whether you can be anti-Zionist without being smeared, tarred, demonized as an anti-Semite. And I want to be clear tonight. You could be the most pro-Israeli person in this room tonight, the most proud and ardent Zionist here, and still vote against this motion with a clear conscience, still vote with our side, the right side. Because this motion is not about whether you are pro-Israel or pro-Zionist. It's about whether the rest of us have the right, the freedom to take a different view on Israel, on Zionism, on Benjamin Netanyahu even, without being silenced, without being told we're racists. We're not. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I'll tell you 3 reasons why. 3 reasons why you should oppose this motion tonight. Number 1, if you vote for this motion tonight, you are throwing logic, history, and the English language under the bus. Because anti-Semitism is hating Jews, the people, and Judaism, the religion. Anti-Zionism is opposing Israel, the state, and Zionism, the ethno-nationalist ideology that underpins that state. Zionism is not Judaism. Let me say that again for the people up top. Zionism is not Judaism. Right? It's a very modern, secular, political ideology movement that was founded less than 150 years ago by an atheist named Theodor Herzl, who said, and I quote, "The anti-Semites will be our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries, our allies." His words, not mine. Number 2, if you vote for this motion, you're throwing Palestinians as a people under the bus. You're telling an occupied people, a dispossessed people, to accept their own occupation, their own dispossession, meekly, in silence. Otherwise, they're racists. As my friend Yusuf Manaya, the Palestinian-American activist, says, to ask Palestinians not to be anti-Zionist is to ask Palestinians not to be. And number 3, last but not least, if you vote for this motion, you're throwing a lot of Jews under the bus as well. Not just Jews like Edwin Samuel Montagu, but Jews today. If you vote for this motion tonight, you're saying my debate partner, Gideon Levy, whose grandparents were killed in the Holocaust, who served for Shimon Peres, who's written for Haaretz for over 40 years, just won Israel's top journalism prize 3 years ago. He's an anti-Semite. You're saying the Satmar, the world's biggest Hasidic Jewish sect, which says it is fighting God's war against Zionism, is anti-Semitic. You're saying Jewish college students on campus, maybe some of them are your kids, members of If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace, they're anti-Semites. You're saying some of the most respected Jewish voices in the world, like Abraham Berg, the former Speaker of the Parliament, Miriam Margolis, the actress from Harry Bloody Potter, they're all anti-Semites. That is what you're saying. That is what you're signing off on if you vote for this motion tonight. So I have a simple solution for you all. Don't do it. Vote instead for common sense, for free speech, and the right to criticize a foreign country, the right to criticize a foreign country and a political ideology. I beg to oppose.
Thank you. Natasha Hausdorff, let's have your opening statement now.
Well, thank you and good evening. What a privilege it is to be here, stood on this stage on what I consider to be the most important topic of our age. I have to begin with a debating tip coming from a land with a culture of a rich history of debate. And that is that in debates, it is for the proposition to define the motion. And Douglas did that for you, loud and clear. Mehdi seems to think that he can redefine anti-Zionism without you noticing, but the proposition are not going to allow him to pull the wool over your eyes and conflate Zionism with politics. Who has the right to define Zionism? Well, apart from the proposition in this debate, because that's how the rules work. Would you ask a misogynist to define misogyny? You wouldn't ask a sex offender to define rape. You wouldn't ask the KKK to define anti-black racism. So why, when it comes to the Jews, would you let the anti-Zionists define anti-Zionism? No, ladies and gentlemen, no minority should have its identity dictated to it. And we have defined Zionism. It concerns the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their ancient homeland. Zionism is not a political ideology. Zionism does not stipulate how the Jewish state should be governed, which is what a political ideology does. It simply says it should exist. It doesn't dictate borders or the makeup of population. It does not say that Israel should be socialist kibbutzim or capitalist startup nation. Israel has exemplified both of those and everything in between. This is not about political ideology. This debate is about racism and creating a double standard where you make an exception for the Jews. Now, you don't have to support Zionism, but if you are anti-Zionist, if you are against the Jews having a state, you are against the Jews. Mehdi Hasan is lying about what Zionism is, and in an attempt to win this debate and to provide cover for his own anti-Semitism, we usually hear a series of lies spewed by anti-Semites and anti-Zionists in an attempt to justify their anti-Zionism, and these are the modern blood libel. They are widely believed as the ancient blood libel, that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual, as widely believed and as false. I'm going to take you through 4 blood libels that anti-Zionists rely on. Number 1, the libel of colonialism. Israel is the ultimate decolonization success story. Against all odds, after Arab imperialism, Islamic conquest, and British colonialism, the Jews indigenous to Judea re-established Israel. My family lived under Ottoman and then British colonialism in Jerusalem long before Yasser Arafat, who was born in Cairo, created Palestinian national identity in the 60s. Number 2, the libel of ethnic cleansing. In 1948, when 5 Arab armies and the local Arab population attacked the fledgling state of Israel with the stated intention of annihilating its people, 700,000 Arabs escaped the fighting. Those that remained became Israeli citizens. The Arab population of Israel has increased tenfold. This is ethnic cleansing? No. Ethnic cleansing is what happened to the Jews in 1948 when Jordan occupied the West Bank. Ethnic cleansing is what happened to 850,000 Jews expelled from Yemen, Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, where they'd lived for thousands of years. Ethnic cleansing left Arab countries Jew-free. Meanwhile, 2 million Arabs live in Israel today. Number 3, the libel of apartheid, because those Arabs that remained in Israel are now 20% of its population, the only free Arabs in the Middle East. They are represented in every area of Israeli society as mayors, army officers, police commanders, members of parliament, and the Supreme Court. I served under Salim Gibran, who put both an Israeli prime minister and a president in jail. And those who propagate the lie of apartheid seek to conflate Arab citizens of Israel with Arabs living under the Palestinian Authority, who have an autonomy and should be voting for their leadership. But President Mahmoud Abbas is now in his 19th year of his 4-year term. Number 4, the libel of genocide, the reprehensible smear that maliciously accuses the Jews of perpetrating the very crimes committed against them. October 7 was the latest in a long history of genocidal acts by Arabs against Jews in the Middle East. The genocide libel inverts reality. Hamas has spent 16 years embedding its terror infrastructure in mosques, schools, hospitals, and every second house. Its central military tactic is to use civilians as human shields. And in the face of these unprecedented challenges, the IDF has taken greater measures to prevent civilian casualties than any other army in history, far exceeding the requirements of international law. Genocide is the latest modern blood libel that anti-Semites use to justify their anti-Zionism, and it is central to Hamas's war strategy. Today, its only aim is to survive, and to achieve this with international pressure on the Jews to cease their self-defense. Voting for the opposition supports Hamas in this endeavor by legitimizing, aiding, and abetting their anti-Zionist aim to wipe out the Jews from the river to the sea. Don't stand with the terrorists and anti-Semites. Stand on the side of moral integrity. Stand with the proposition.
It is just the weirdest shit to me when people at these kinds of high prestige debates like have the cadences and the wording and the tone that just makes them sound like they're part of a really bad high school theater production company.
That was, yeah. I mean, I just can't believe how stupid that was. Like that was just so stupid. Like that was, I just can't believe how stupid that was. Like it's kind of infuriating to me. Like she addressed the question in like the first minute and a half, said dumb stuff about it, and then talked about a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with the proposition.
Yeah.
Like it would, just like Douglas Murray did, and people are clapping and they're like, oh yeah, this is great. Like, what the fuck? This, like, it just, yeah, I don't know. I find it shocking how bad that was. Like, also, it was funny because she starts accusing Mehdi of changing the terms of the debate. And like, I thought where she was going, which I was like, okay, interesting, was, oh, well, like everything you said, Mehdi, like, that's fine. Like, I agree with you. It's just that the debate's not about that. That's not what we mean by anti-Zionism, right? Like, I thought she was going to say, like, you can be critical of Israel, but that's not the kind of anti-Zionism that we've agreed to in this debate. Like, I thought, but then instead,
kind of what she was doing for the first half of her statement.
She was trying to do, but then she gave up the game completely when she was like, but Mehdi's just doing that to hide his anti-Semitism. And I'm like, okay, so like what he's saying is anti-Semitic on your view. So,
right. So right. So it's, yeah. So it's, she's trying to have it both ways, both like, okay, none of what he's saying is anti-Zionism. It's only like the really extreme view that counts as anti-Zionism. Clearly that's anti-Semitic. Also, though, everything he just said is anti-Semitic.
Yes,
so like,
exactly.
Why even bother with the first part then?
But she didn't even make that argument very clear. That's actually where I thought she was going, right? So like she kind of started saying, oh, he's changing the terms of the debate. And I was like, okay, say more, right? Like flesh that out. But instead she just like moves on and calls him an anti-Semite anyway. And I'm like, okay, you're just,
yeah.
And then she talked for a while and said a bunch of nonsense, like made no arguments.
Yeah. It's like she just like, it's literally like she just like didn't prepare like for the proposition. And so she's like, oh, like, what are like 5 like PragerU talking points I've heard about like things that anti-Zionists say that are false? And so just this completely like tangential rant about like a bunch of issues that just don't have anything to do with the topic. That was bizarre.
Yeah.
But even like the part where she was trying to address like, oh, he's like redefining anti-Semitism, like even that part, like I feel like I would almost have to go back and like listen again because it was like so bizarre. Like she claimed something about how like, oh, well, Mehdi claims that Zionism is a political ideology, but Zionism doesn't say anything about how the government should be run, which is what a political ideology is. But it's like that's just not what a political ideology is. Like there is plenty of political ideologies that don't specify how the government should be run. Like
or they might even be against government.
Yeah, exactly. Like anarchism, like wouldn't be a political ideology on this view. Like socialism doesn't seem to say anything about how the government should be run per se. It's about how the economy should be structured. So it's just like that's clearly not the right way to define a political ideology. But like, and then she said something about how like it's not a political ideology, it's about like race or something. But it's like, well, how did we get to like race? Like we're talking about support for a state for like a religious group of people, I guess also a race, but like just very, very confusing opening statement.
Yeah, I mean it's Zionism as is universally understood now, right? Because I mean there was more ambiguity about it like 100 years ago, right? Because even sort of Jews moving en masse to British mandatory Palestine and and reviving the Hebrew language and all that stuff, right? It's like that was all, because that was all sort of new stuff that people were like trying to get people to do, right? So at that point, like Zionism was used broadly enough to include all that. And so if you were somebody who thought that's like, oh yeah, the ultimate goal, this is like the Martin Buber wing of Zionism back then, should be to have like a binational Jewish and Arab state, that was considered a form of Zionism. Now that would be universally considered to be a form of anti-Zionism, right? So it's like clearly Zionism in any sense that anybody has used it in like the last 70 years means support for Israel being a Jewish ethno-state, right? And which is whatever else you want to say, which is, by the way, I mean, her and Douglas Murray's definitions are just a slightly differently phrased way of saying support for Israel being a Jewish ethno-state. So, like, that's not even controversial, right? Between the sides here, right? That's like, yeah, that's what Zionism means. And that is clearly a political ideology, right? The view that Israel should be a Jewish ethno-state, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, like that's a political claim, right? So what are you even talking about? When you say, oh, this is not a political claim, it's like, yeah, that's like a basic political claim that's consistent with making a number of different political claims, right? But it's like, that's like saying, that if you're a democratic dissident in some authoritarian country or whatever, like pro-democracy isn't a political claim because it leaves open the question of what policies the democratically elected government should implement. Right? It's like, no, clearly pro-democracy is a political ideology, right? Like that's an insane thing to deny, and it's a weirdly pointless thing to deny. But also, okay, so when she did her 4, am I missing one? Because I feel like there were 5, but I only caught 4 libels. There was the libel of colonialism, the libel of ethnic cleansing, the libel of apartheid, and the libel of genocide.
None of which have to do with the proposition, by the way.
No, not even a little bit.
None of it. Like none of it had anything to do with the argument. Like it's just
right. Like
it was just standard pro-Israeli talking points that have nothing to do with what they're talking about.
Yeah, this was all just like, oh, here are things anti-Zionists typically believe, and they're wrong, right? And like the only thing that was like sort of trying to like tie it back into the debate was to conflate this with like the anti-Semitic blood libel, which again is fucking insane, like just on its face. Because like even if for the sake of argument all 4 of these were wrong, I mean I think all 4 of them are right, but like even if you think all 4 of them are wrong, like what do you call that, a blood libel? I mean it's like this, like if the if like let's say you were a really strong supporter of the war in Vietnam, right? That you really believed in the domino theory, you thought that LBJ was doing the right thing, whatever. Hey, plenty of anti-war people at the time were saying the U.S. was committing genocide in Vietnam. That was actually like a very common New Left talking point. So it's like, if you thought they were wrong, does that mean that you're like logically committed to think like that you would think it was like, oh, see, what people are doing to the Americans by saying they're committing genocide in Vietnam is a misrepresentation, and the Passover blood libel was a misrepresentation. So see, same thing. Right? Like it's just a weird, like it's just a weird connection to even try to make. But the thing, like the first thing that really struck me about all that was that she was making this like super woke argument on both the colonialism point and the defining the terms point. And it was a little bit funny to see Douglas fucking Murray nodding along the whole time.
Yeah, I saw that.
In this like super woke, like it's just this class, like she's just appealing to all these like, again, stuff that I think is really dumb in any context. I would reject in every context, not just this one, but she's making like just basic identity politics premises. And Douglas Murray's like, oh yeah, that's right. It's like, what other context would you agree with this?
Yeah.
This, that's like, oh, what counts as racism should only get, white people don't have any kind of vote about what counts as racism. Does Douglas Murray agree with that? I don't think so. Right? Yeah. Like, I think Douglas Murray, if a black person called him a racist and he was pushing back, they're like, I don't know, only black people get to define racism. I don't think he would accept that. Right? Like, I think he'd be like, no, what's true is true, no matter who's saying it. Here's my argument, right? Like, and so, yeah, there's the weird standpoint epistemology shit, which also, part of the basic problem here. I mean, this is like the Matt Brunig argument about identitarian deference, is that there's always a question of like, okay, well, hold on. You're never going to have unanimity within any oppressed group about anything, right? Like that's not how people work. So is it just a matter of a majority vote? Right? Like, if the, women right now are 60-40 pro-choice, pro-life, but like, it's not impossible to imagine the political scene changing so that it flipped to being the other way around. Right? Like, does that mean that deferring to women would actually mean being pro-life? Right? That's the Brunig point. And, it seems like something very similar, should apply here, right? It's like, was there a big Jewish vote I missed about, like how to define anti-Semitism? Like, so that's that's one thing. And then when she's talking about the libel of colonialism, you know, she says, oh, Israel is the ultimate decolonial project because, you know, because Jews are the really indigenous people. It's like, okay. Well, first of all, by the way, this is a good time as any. I forgot to do it at the beginning to say, so I have this pamphlet from Everyday Analysis, 4 essays on Palestine that I think is at the printer now. We're probably going to be doing a launch event in LA in late October and in the UK when I'm there for historical materialism in November. But you know, that includes the nobody's rights should depend on where their ancestors lived article that's all about this, and the Substack follow-up, the Marx and Rawls versus Nozick and the Land Back Left. So it's like, look, all of which is just to establish that I don't agree with this stuff in any context or any direction, right? Like I don't give a shit who counts as the officially indigenous group. Like I don't think that should be relevant to what rights you have. But you know who I'm quite sure would not buy this in any other context is Douglas Murray.
100%.
Right? Or her for that matter. It's like, or anybody in the audience. Like, you know, if a bunch of, I don't know, indigenous Canadians somehow got like alien technology so they were able to overwhelm the Canadian military and, you know, found an ethno state, that would be just fine because they got there first.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
What are we even doing? And then,
what are we doing here? What are we doing?
And the lie of apartheid, her argument is just the standard argument that, well, that sure, there are millions of Arabs who have never been given Israeli citizenship despite 57 years of Israel ruling over them, despite the fact that the Knesset recently voted by 68-9 that there would never, ever be a Palestinian state, despite the fact that Israel has spent 57 years building cities full of its own citizens on this territory. So you're saying, and every Zionist is very open about this. I've never heard one that will deny this, right? It's like, yes, the one and only reason that those millions of Arabs on the West Bank and Gaza have never been given Israeli citizenship is because if they did, then the ethnic character of the state would change, right? Like that is, again, they're so open about this. So yeah, if you have millions of people who are denied citizenship in your state because they have the wrong ethnicity, that if that doesn't fit the definition of apartheid, whatever definition you're working with is a bad definition that doesn't capture the concept. Like that's exactly what apartheid means. And just said, oh, but there are these other Arabs that we eventually decided to let become citizens, which by the way took about 19 years after Israel was founded. It was like 1966. They lifted the military rule on the Arabs on their side of the Green Line, right? So there's like maybe a year when you could say that there wasn't apartheid, but like look, it's saying, denying millions of people who live within our current borders, the borders we've had for the last 57 years, the borders our official positions that we'll continue to have until the end of time, that denying millions of people within this border citizenship because they have the wrong ethnicity, that's not apartheid because we did decide to let some other people who have the same ethnicity be citizens. Like, so fucking silly on its face. I mean, it's like, yeah, how is that relevant? Like, yeah, if you said, if like clearly like the United States in 1940, I hope everybody would agree it was an apartheid state, right? Like clearly what Jim Crow was a version of apartheid. The fact that black people were allowed to vote in New York State doesn't mean that the denial of voting rights to black people in Alabama counts as any less as apartheid. And that's not even to get into the, severe limits on political participation by Israeli Arabs within the Green Line and, et cetera, right? It's like, that's all just kind of ridiculous. But the one that was most ridiculous was the libel of ethnic cleansing, which before the diarrhea of whataboutism that followed this claim, she said that she described what she herself takes to have gone on in 1948. And she was like, okay, there's this war and 700,000 Arabs fled to avoid the war. It's like, okay, hold on. People are allowed to flee. Like, obviously, one, she's doing historical revisionism, that, you know, Israeli historians, some of whom are not remotely left-wing, Benny Morris, for example, have extensively documented the Haganah atrocities that, you know, burning down villages, you know, randomly killing people, etc., that like drove out a lot of those people. But even if her version of history was correct, it wouldn't matter. Like, it wouldn't make ethnic cleansing a libel. If 700,000 people flee a war zone and then they're not allowed to come back because they have the wrong ethnicity, that is absolutely ethnic cleansing. Like, people who flee war zones are allowed to come back when the war is over. Like, that's a universal right in, you know, international humanitarian law. And if you're saying, oh, that doesn't apply to these people because if so, too many of the people with the wrong ethnicity would be here, how is that not ethnic cleansing?
I know, and just to remind everyone, I mean, all of that is moot though, because it's not about the debate either, right? Like, all of that stuff is like that she was arguing about. I mean, it's good to respond to it, but I'm just saying, like, like the fact that she even made those points is like totally out of the scope.
Yeah, exactly. And also, Jeb's point is very good that the way apartheid actually worked in South Africa was that legally South Africans were not citizens of South Africa, but citizens of their individual Bantustans, right? So, you know, and yeah, saying, oh, well, the Palestinians, the West Bank have autonomy because, you know, because of the Palestinian Authority. First of all, at best, you're only applying that to Area C, right, in the West Bank. But two, it's like, oh, so you have like, is that how it works? That you're allowed to keep people as non-citizen subjects forever? Of, you know, and they could never be allowed to have citizenship in your country. They could never be allowed to secede and form a state of your own. That's totally cool and non-apartheidy if they have autonomy, right? But yeah, Victor's point is the most important. It's like all of this stuff is like infuriating on its own terms, but also all of it's completely irrelevant because it's like,
completely irrelevant.
These are things anti-Zionists typically believe. She thinks that they're wrong. Fine, we can have a nice argument about that, but even if she's right that they're wrong, it still wouldn't make anti-Zionism.
It doesn't matter.
Anti-Semitism, right?
Yeah,
it's like,
matter.
If you believe a bunch of things about the Soviet Union that are exaggerated or false,
yeah,
then that doesn't mean that you're an anti-Russian racist.
Yeah, no,
exactly.
it's like they're having like a debate about like all socialists hate rich people, and then you get up and you just start saying like, well, socialists say that, you know, wages have been stagnant for a long time, and that's not true. And socialists think that, you know, economic equality correlates with economic growth, and that's not true. And it's just like, yeah, like, I guess, but, you know.
Doesn't really matter for what we're talking about here.
Yeah, right. That's also, still not like, even if it like, yeah, the truth of this would have nothing to do with anything.
And also just like their whole, like, I feel like we've watched a lot of debates and a lot of wrong people and a lot of like stupid things. Something about both of these openings I found especially infuriating, and I've been trying to think about why. And like, it's not even because I have like strong stakes in this. I mean, I do obviously agree with you guys, but you two are way more like up on the Israel-Palestine stuff than I am. But like, I think the thing that infuriates me about both her and Douglas Murray is I just feel like they fucking know what they're doing. Like, I feel like they're being bad faith. Like, I'm watching them and I'm like, you know that these arguments make no sense. And obviously there's no way to verify that, but I don't know. I just get a feeling when I was seeing her talk, I was like, she fucking knows what she's doing.
No, yeah, totally. I assume both of these people are bad faith.
Yes.
I mean, and I don't normally assume people are bad faith. But,
neither do I.
No, I mean, Douglas Murray is fine. And this woman, this is the first time hearing from her.
Yeah.
But
still
yeah,
bad faith.
Every time I've heard Douglas Murray talk, it's like, okay, like this guy's just a fucking slime ball.
People being wrong on their own doesn't make me that mad when I feel like they're actually in good faith or like they're actually trying, even if they're like super like stupid about something. I'm like, okay, whatever. But like, they feel very bad faith to me.
Yeah, no, I agree for sure.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
Thank you, Natasha Hausdorff. Gideon Levy, we're going to have your opening statement now.
Thank you very much. This couldn't have happened in Israel, that so many people will have so much interest and come to such an evening. I can't prevent a remark that I didn't plan to say to what Douglas had just said. To stand here today, 8 months after this war started, and to talk only about the Jewish victims, totally ignoring 38,000 people who were killed in those 8 months, totally ignoring the starvation, the destruction, the tens of thousands of children which were killed, tells the whole story. After this, you almost don't need to continue, because when you don't see the other, when you're victimizing yourself and totally ignore the other suffer, the other agony, then really we have no basis here. Now I want to get back to my, I couldn't help it, sorry. I will start with a personal note. If not Zionism, I wouldn't have been here tonight. My father said goodbye, my late father said goodbye to his parents and fiancée in the railway station of Prague in 1939. He went on a boat, illegal boat, 5 months in the sea. No port would accept them, detention in Beirut, Lebanon, and finally illegally arriving in Israel. He had no idea about Zionism. He hardly knew Judaism. He never knew the difference between Purim and Pesach until his last day. I always had to explain him, when Purim you eat matzot. No, it's Pesach when you eat matzot. But he came here to Israel, and Zionism saved him. Zionism at its beginning was a just cause which was performed with many, many mistakes and even crimes. But the idea that the Jews deserve a rescue place was the most moral idea that I could have thought at those days. But years passed by. Zionism, which nobody today in Israel knows to define exactly. Many Israelis will tell you that to help an old lady to cross the road, even if she doesn't want to cross the road, that's Zionism. But Zionism today is the scaffold, that's a word that I wrote myself and I will never know to pronounce it, the scaffolding of a building which was built already. And once you built it, you don't need it anymore. Zionism today has only one meaning, and nobody can find any other meaning. It is Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea. That's the real meaning of Zionism today. I was a good boy in Tel Aviv for many years. I got Zionism with the milk of my mother. You mentioned all my sins. Yes, I was in the army. I was working for Shimon Peres. I was a Zionist until I realized that Zionism means national supremacy of one people over the other. And I cannot support any kind of supremacy anywhere. Yes, it was a nice lie to tell that the people without a land arrived to a land without a people. And we were brought up according to those stories. I heard the word Nakba first time in my life when I was 20. I saw the ruins along the street and on the roads in Israel. I never asked, where are the people who lived in those ruins? What happened to them? We had no interest for this. But you get adult, and I started to cover the occupation. It's now 40 years that I'm covering the occupation, and I cannot accept Jewish supremacy. But that's my problem. It's not necessarily your problem. What must be really understood is that Zionism, as my friend Mehdi just mentioned, is an ideology. You might support it, you might not support it. Israel, the Jewish people had defined themselves already. We have a strong regional superpower, and we live in a state which is more Jewish than democratic, and the struggle should be between the two, and this struggle is still ahead of us. But Zionism finished its role many years ago. It is meaningless today, but still people might believe in it. That's fine with me. My request from you tonight is don't fall to the trap of the Israeli propaganda. The strategy of Israel in recent years is efficient and successful, and you shouldn't fall to the trap because it's finally also your problem. Not any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. Not every policeman who writes a ticket to a Jewish driver is an anti-Semite. You may be anti-Israeli in the way that you are anti-occupation, anti-apartheid, and still have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. I'll tell you more than this. Israel has succeeded by this to silence any criticism. And take my word, there is nothing that Israel needs now more than criticism, because Israel will never save itself by its own. Israel will never put an end to the occupation without you, without the criticism of the world. Thank you very much.
What a terrific set of opening statements. Thank you, all of you. This debate is off and running. We're now going to move to rebuttal. So this is 3 minutes on the clock for each of you to react to what you've just heard. We'll do that in the same order as the opening. So Douglas, you're up first.
Thank you very much. There's quite a lot to reply to there. Let me first say, Gideon, you started with a peroration about me not mentioning the Palestinian casualties. That's because I started by mentioning the war. And there is no law of war that says you're allowed to start a war and then complain when you lose it. And if Mehdi cares about the Palestinian casualties, as I'm sure he does, then tell your bosses in Qatar to tell their friends in Gaza to stop the war and give back the hostages. Gideon says Israel needs nothing more than criticism. If Israel doesn't get criticism, wow, he doesn't even read his own country's press. By the way, you said the other day in an interview, Gideon, I couldn't care less about the Jewish state. So we know very well where you're coming from. Let me just say a couple of things about that I didn't get to in my opening remarks, but are important. You know, if you didn't throng the streets of this city or any other for the actual genocide going on in Sudan, not the one that Mehdi and Gideon pretend is happening, but the actual genocide going on in Sudan, if you didn't spend weekend after weekend doing that, but you did come out for the post-October the 7th protests, you're an anti-Semite. If, like Mehdi once sent a tweet condemning that, it doesn't give you quite enough smoke cover. You know, if you protested not a bit, didn't set up a tent when Bashar al-Assad was killing 6 times the number of people in a decade that Israel and all of its enemies have lost in 75 years of war, you are an anti-Semite. And I would just add one other thing. I know that the media has tried to reframe the motion. I'm not going to allow it either. You know, maybe there is somebody in the world. Pakistan was invented, created as a state around the same time as Israel. I reckon that if this debate tonight was about Pakistan, Pakistan started a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of casualties, caused a lot of casualties. But you know what? If somebody said, I think Pakistan should be abolished. They just don't have the right to a state, and although they had one set up for them many decades ago, we should abolish it. I think people would say, And then if the person said, but, oh, by the way, although I want to abolish that state, I have no problem with the Pakistani people. Please, please, of course you would.
Opportunity for rebuttal, 3 minutes on the clock.
God, I hate him so much. He's so bad.
Yeah.
Dude,
He's still not talking about how Mehdi tried to reframe the debate. Like he's trying to reframe the debate. I'm not going to allow him, and then goes on to say nothing about.
He tries to reframe the debate. How? Like you can't just say that without at least giving us a sentence of here's the thing he said that reframes.
Yeah.
And here's how it's different from what the original framing was. Like just like you clearly. Oh my God! And like he also. So like the original claim, his debate partner's name I've already forgotten.
I don't remember either.
But that's the let's just call her Model UN because that's like what the tone and and feel of the speech was, right? So in Model UN's opening, she said like her big objection to Mehdi reframing was that I don't even know if this is true, but he'd given like a definition and like besides the identity politics argument that like the people who the group with the historically oppressed group merit badge is the one that's allowed to define terms. Like her other argument was that the laws of debate mean that the people who are defending the proposition get to define terms. It was like an insane thing to say. It's like I don't know, mate. I don't know.
She also didn't offer her own alternative framing. She just said that he reframed them and then moved on.
Yeah. It's like, look, maybe the rules of the debate club at your prep school included that, but the idea that this is just some sort of like general thing about all arguments that who's ever like, in the affirmative gets to define stuff. It's like, no, like, surely in an argument, given a topic like anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, how to define both of those terms is going to be like central to what's a dispute, right? Like I don't see how that could not be the case, right? So you don't get to say that like one side just doesn't get to put forward views about how to analyze either of those two concepts, but yeah, so that was crazy. He quoted Gideon Levy saying that he couldn't care less about the Jewish state. Now, I have no idea what he's quoting. He didn't tell us where he said that or what the context was or anything, but I would still put money down that what Gideon Levy said in context was that he couldn't care less about Israel's like character as a Jewish state. So like if you let too many Arab people become citizens, they would lose that character, that's the thing he was saying he doesn't care about. In other words, like, he's not a racist, right? Like that's the, I'm 99% sure, right? Like I'd be amazed if that wasn't the context. Then there was all the whataboutism about Sudan and Syria. And this is maybe the sleaziest part, that one, people saying this stuff never actually want you, like, they're never saying it because they want you to care more about Sudan. They're just saying it because they want you to care less about Gaza, right? So it's because it's like, look, even if this was an objectionable double standard, it's like, oh, that given how much you care about Gaza, you should care more about Sudan. It's like, okay, but that's consistent with either saying therefore care less about Gaza or therefore care more about Sudan. If it was the second one, I'm open to that. But if it's the first one, right, then it's like, oh, this is just morally despicable, right? That you're saying like, oh, you should care less about these horrifying crimes against humanity that are happening right now because there were some other ones that you didn't care very much about. It's like, no, that's depraved. Yeah. But also, like, this is all even accepting for the sake of argument that it's a reasonable one-to-one comparison, which is obviously not, right? It's like yes, Canadians and Americans are protesting the atrocities committed by the governments of Syria and Sudan, which neither the United States nor Canada supported or participated in any way, right? Whenever you say things like that, it's like, yeah, people like Douglas Murray seem to think that what a protest is just sort of a random venting of emotion about something happening somewhere in the world. And it's like, well, ideally, the point of a protest is to change the policies of the institution you're protesting. Right? It's like that's what a protest is. I mean, anything else is just kind of a, I don't know, awareness raising exercise, I guess. But like a protest is you're protesting what somebody is doing to try to get them to do it differently. So it's like, yeah, if obviously, if you're a Canadian or a U.S. citizen, what you're going to be protesting is the crimes that the Canadian or U.S. government are supporting or participating in. And it's like, yeah, there aren't any, the United States was not sending barrel bombs to Assad to bomb rebels, right? Justin Trudeau, wasn't giving assistance to the government of Sudan, while it was committing atrocities in Darfur, right? So it's like, this is just like on every level, the analogy could just completely fails.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah, it's always sort of a bizarre comparison. Like, I mean, even if you can point to examples of like, oh, well, here's like some atrocity that we did have something to do with that people aren't as up in arms about. Like, even then it's like, okay, well, but surely like the US has a uniquely close relationship to Israel.
Right.
And so like, it makes sense for people who live in the US to be disproportionately concerned with that. And it's interesting because like, people say there's like this like double standard, like, oh, we care more about, we're more upset when Israel does something, but we don't care when some other country does something bad. But like, I would imagine that the US, like if you were to poll US citizens, we're probably like more united on the fact that like what Saudi Arabia is doing to Yemenis people is like bad than we are on the fact that like what Israel is doing to Palestinians are bad, Like if anything, like I were to guess, like while it's true that maybe some people on the left are more exercised by Israel's wrongdoing than the wrongdoing of other parties, I would say that, there's obviously a large contingent of people in America who are more concerned with, or who are more forgiving of Israel's wrongdoing than that of other parties, like a Saudi Arabia or something like that.
Oh, totally. I mean, and it's funny actually. So Douglas, to be fair, didn't do this just now, but I've totally had, like when I did my Munk podcast debate with Jamie Kirchik, and he was doing his whataboutism. I think he actually mentioned Yemen, which is like awesome because it's like, look, if you're saying that the left is hypocritical because they're like mad about Gaza but not about Yemen, it's like, I don't know, man. I'm pretty sure the left is almost like the only part of American society that was at all upset about Yemen, right? Like that, certainly Bernie Sanders, was led the effort in the Senate to cut off U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. And, I know there are also some libertarian Republicans and whatnot who are opposed to that, but so that's, so it's like, yeah, that's a particularly ill-chosen example, but also like if the conclusion to the earlier point is we should have cared more about Yemen. Yeah, I'm with you. We should have, right? There should have been more outrage about Yemen, but that's a completely different conclusion than there should be less outrage right now about Gaza. Right? Like, it's like, no, these are two things that both merit lots of outrage. It's like, yes, Gaza, is honestly, I think still not getting anything like what it should, right? But like, Yemen probably should have gotten more. I'm totally open to that critique, but that would be a rare instance of something that's like, no, the United States is actually involved in. And even there, and I think maybe this is what you're getting at, Ethan, it's like, yeah, if you also like want to explain why some things get more attention than others, like, look, I think Yemen was horrifying, and yeah, there should have been more protests about it. I think it's great that Bernie did what he did to try to stop it, but should have been more focus on it. But also, like, yeah, you don't have unanimous establishment enthusiasm for Saudi Arabia doing whatever they want to in Yemen. You don't have like major politicians of both parties tripping over each other to do these loyalty oaths to like how much they love Saudi Arabia, and and how the United States will always support Saudi Arabia's right to defend itself in Yemen. Like it's, yeah, you have this obsessive, constant pro-Israel sentiment at the highest levels of the U.S. state that shines a spotlight on that issue. So obviously anti-war protests are going to reflect go towards that spotlight. But yeah, if you want to criticize it because people aren't protesting other atrocities that their country is supporting. Protesting atrocities that your country is not supporting is just pointless. Right? It's like, yeah, you don't like nobody in 1942 was doing protest marches about atrocities being committed by the Nazis or the Japanese in New York City, because that would have been a weird, pointless thing to do. It's like, no, those are enemies of ours, and that's not like, oh, we should stop supporting them because we're already fighting them. Like, the double standard should only arise in cases where the United States is also supporting atrocities. And then even in those cases, the conclusion shouldn't be, therefore care less about this atrocity. It should be, therefore care more about this other atrocity. And then finally, to the point that, Victor's been making all along, like, yeah, assume for the sake of argument there's a double standard. Nice. All right.
Yeah,
why does that mean that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism?
Exactly. Totally irrelevant. I was wondering, did you address, because he made that, Douglas Murray made that slimy kind of comparison to like the Bangladesh, or was it Bangladesh or Pakistan? I don't know. Did you talk about that? Pakistan? Did I zone out and miss you talking about that?
No, I didn't say anything about Pakistan.
Okay. Because like I think that one seemed to land really well with the audience, so I think it's like worth talking about that. And I think in general also, I wanted to mention something that Gideon said, kind of, that like, I don't know, we haven't talked that much about the side that we obviously agree with and think is a lot better. But like he did say something that I don't know if it troubled me, but I was like, where like, I guess to be like charitable and consistent, I just think that like it would be possible to be a Zionist and not be a Jewish supremacist. Like he kind of made that claim, and I felt like that deserved like maybe a little bit of criticism, because I was like I agree that it's like, I think functionally, like the function of Zionism right now, it does have like Jewish supremacist effects maybe, but I still think it's possible. And I feel like I know in fact, there's a guy in my PhD program who's like, from Israel, and I don't think that he's a Jewish supremacist, right? But he's a Zionist, I think, at least to some extent. So I think that maybe that's worth talking about, those two things.
Yeah. Doesn't like Chomsky even call himself a Zionist?
I think the point that Chomsky makes, at least I've seen him make in the past, is that, because he was like a Zionist. I mean, he was like actually literally like a Zionist youth activist before the foundation of the state of Israel. And the point that I've seen him make is that he like hasn't really changed his mind. But like the views that used to be considered Zionist are now considered anti-Zionist. So he's like, yeah, whatever, apply whatever label you want, right? This is still what I think. I guess in defense of Gideon's point, and like, yeah, I didn't pause after Mehdi, because like I thought that Mehdi's was like just
everything he said was right, I think.
Yeah, I just didn't have anything to add, right? But or subtract, right? It all just seemed right. Then Gideon, yeah, I think he was like a little bit more all over the place, but there was nothing that like really jumped out at me as like
I agree
commenting on. But as to like Jewish supremacism and Zionism, I guess maybe this goes into the Pakistan analogy too a little bit. I think it depends, right? So if you, so let me see if I get this right. So like the case for you could be a Zionist without being a Jewish supremacist is that you could be a Zionist, but you could support, a two-state solution and not a two-state solution in the sort of like bad joke way that like past Israeli governments have supported, where like what they're really talking about is this like weird demilitarized semi-state that with, that would either be like pockmarked with the next settlement blocks and Israeli railroads patrolled by Israeli soldiers, but like a real meaningful Palestinian state in like
and maybe even supporting like full dismantling of all the settlements in the West Bank and still be a Zionist in the sense
right.
Of like,
yeah, I agree that that's an internally consistent position. I would note that it's like, as you said, functionally, that's, like that Knesset vote saying, there wouldn't be a two-state solution. There were like some mainstream Zionist Knesset deputies who like skipped the votes. They wouldn't have to go on record one way or the other. but like none of them actually voted against it, right? So, and again, you know, even the sort of most liberal Israeli governments have never supported anything like a real two-state solution. But yeah, look, in theory, I think that is all coherent. I guess in defense of Gideon, though, on that point, I would say that if it's still like, obviously that version of Zionism is like vastly politically preferable to like the dominant version that exists right now. But say, is there still something Jewish supremacist about it? It's like, well, look, if you're saying, if what you mean by being a Zionist is you think that it's like a legitimate sort of institutional goal to like ensure that this is always a Jewish majority state forever, and in defense of that goal, even if, again, you support going way further in a two-state direction than like pretty much anybody in Israel does right now, like certainly anybody in government in Israel does right now, then presumably at the very least, that means that, you know, you don't think that the ethnic cleansing refugees from 1948 should be able to come back because, you know, I mean, at least that's the typical argument, that letting them come back would endanger, you know, the Jewish character of the state, because there would be too many Arabs when you put returning refugees together with the existing Israeli Arab majority, you get a minority, right? So, so I think that would, you know, it's at least unclear to me that there's space to be sort of robustly not Jewish supremacist at all, right? You know, consistent with Zionism. But I certainly see the point that you could be a Zionist and be like much less Jewish supremacist than what functionally Zionism means right now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like just to kind of stay, like, I think the reason it stood out was just to stay in sort of the spirit of the point that this debate is supposed to be about like the possibility of like, you know, being able to be an anti-Zionist and not an anti-Semite or whatever. I was just like, well, not that he was making the claim that like, oh, if you're a Zionist, you're like for sure a Jewish supremacist, but I don't know. I just thought it was worth flagging. I don't know. Go ahead.
Yes, right. There was a very similar point I thought about bringing up, but forgot earlier in the debate where Mehdi Hasan said something. I thought Mehdi Hasan's opening statement was like far and away the best of anybody here, but he did say something that sort of seemed false to me, which was something about how if you tell Palestinians that they can't be anti-Zionist, then that means that they have to support like their own like repression. And I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, it certainly seems like you could have like a Jewish ethno-state and that doesn't involve like any oppression of Palestinians. Well, maybe not. I mean, or not a Jewish ethno-state, but at the very least, like I think you could probably imagine there being like a by and large Jewish state where, you know, Israel kind of relinquishes Gaza, relinquishes the West Bank, gives more or less equal rights to the Arabs that live in Israel. So I'm not sure it's that the rejection I'm not sure that acceptance of Zionism requires the
I think it maybe almost requires it, just because one, you know, I think the denial of the right of return for refugees is almost baked in. And like, that does seem like, you know, I mean, that does seem to me like to be a human rights violation that's sort of done in the name of, you know, keeping the ethnic character of the state correct. And then two, I would just say, like, you know, if, you know, to the extent that you're saying, like, you know, look, if somebody had said the United States or Canada, you know, should be a white Christian state, it's like really important that white Christians always be the majority in the United States or Canada, right? Like, I would think that was pretty racist, right? I would have a big problem with that, and that does seem like a pretty direct analogy. You know, I think that you could, in theory, I mean, I guess you could like say that there would be like a kind of two-state solution, that it's like nobody advocates, but like just for fun here, right? Like that you could say like, actually there should be a two-state solution where the Israeli state is like much less than the pre-1967 borders to make sure that you still have a Jewish majority after you let back in refugees. And then I guess there's like pretty much no, but like even there, I would just worry about like anything that it's like, look, if it's like the raison d'etre of this to be a Jewish state, that, you know, we're like really drawing the borders to make sure we have a Jewish majority, then it's like, yeah, what does that say about the status of non-Jewish citizens and like, you know, and like the extent to which it's like their state. And that's maybe where the Pakistan analogy becomes most interesting, because I think that, you know, I know vastly less about India-Pakistan than I do about Israel-Palestine. I want to be upfront about that, right? Like, so I could be wrong about this, but like you know, my sense is that while there were certainly lots of atrocities that happened around the time of partition, right, there's probably no kind of one-to-one parallel there, right, about like, you know, the right of return issue or anything like that. So if, you know, I mean, look, I think the partition of the Indian subcontinent was, like, on the face of it, a terrible idea, right? I mean, it had froze ethnic divisions in place for like, we're getting close to a century now, right? And you know, and it just perpetuated conflict. And you know, I don't know that you know, I don't, you know, maybe say it's just not practical or just logistically not desirable to end it. But then, you know, I think it's also a very different situation, because now you have two nation states that actually have existed for 80 years, as opposed to a nation state that's existed for 80 years, and then another one whose existence is a little theoretical, and like, you know, what it would even mean for it to, you know, so it like, you know, I think that Murray's analogy is a bad analogy, but like also I think, look, if you wanted to, like, if you were going to advocate the reunification of India and Pakistan, like I'm God, such a giant country, it's so politically diverse. I'm sure somebody does, right? Like, you know, that doesn't by itself strike me as an obvious, like, you know, even if you think that's a terrible idea, right? It doesn't obviously strike me as like, you know, as evidence of anti-Pakistani racism.
Yeah. Yeah, we should probably continue. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Oof. Oof. I love the fact that Natasha started the speech by saying, our side cannot define Zionism, anti-Zionism, or anti-Semitism. So Gideon, you and I should just go check out the CN Tower, because I'm not sure what the debate's about. We're being told by the proposition that we must follow their definitions of what we're here to argue and vote about, which tells you how authoritarian that side of the motion. This debate for me tonight is fascinating, because for years Douglas has been the free speech warrior, and I've been the guy saying there's no right to absolute free speech. Tonight I feel the roles are reversed. I'm here to say, what happened to free speech? What happened to the ability to criticize others, governments, countries, yes, political ideologies? Natasha, Theodore Herzl would be surprised to hear you say it wasn't a political ideology or a national movement. And I just find it fascinating that Natasha made it very clear that non-Jews cannot define anything to do with this. And then Douglas stepped up and accused every Jewish protester against Israel of being an anti-Semite, which I find offensive and ridiculous. Thousands upon thousands of Jews. You don't have to agree with them, remember. You don't have to agree with them. But they took their right to go out on the streets in Toronto, in DC, in New York, in London, in Paris, all over the world, in Tel Aviv, to protest against what's happening in Gaza. And Douglas, one of the world's most proud atheists, not Jewish as far as I know, just damned them all as anti-Semites. Wow, that speaks volumes about where this debate is going and who is defining what and how. As for Natasha's line and Douglas's line that if you don't support self-determination for a particular group, you're a bigot. Well, you know, we've already had a lot of votes, so I won't ask you to click. I don't have power over your clickers, but I'd love to know how many people in this room either were in the last Quebec referendum or supported it from afar. Because we're in Canada, where a bunch of people want to leave Canada and do their own thing, and I'm sure many people in this room legitimately oppose that, and no one says you're bigots towards the people of Quebec. Nobody says you're anti-French language. You're allowed to have a debate about whether Canada includes Quebec or not. And, you know, my friend Peter Beinart, who is Jewish, just so Douglas will call him an anti-Semite later, as he pointed out, the Basques, the Catalans, the Kurds, the Scots, they don't have states. And if you oppose them having states, you're not an anti-Kurd bigot, you're not an anti-Scot bigot, you're not an anti-Catalan bigot. People have arguments all the time. There are 5,000 indigenous groups in the world today. According to the UN, there are 193 member states of the UN. You do the math, right? So this is ridiculous, this argument that we are being expected to believe that if you don't support Israel as it is currently constituted, with Jewish supremacy, as Gideon points out, that makes you an anti-Semite. It's an abuse of anti-Semitism. It empties at a very important concept, at a very urgent time of all meaning, in order to defend a country which, as Gideon has pointed out, and which Douglas seems to think is fine, has killed tens of thousands of innocent people in recent months.
All right. So I haven't been in the habit, but since it did turn out there was some stuff last time. Anybody have anything on this?
No, I mean, I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah,
I don't have much to say about that.
yeah. No, it seemed very, very solid to me. And yeah, it's I get, you know, I mean, honestly, the only thing to my mind that's left out is the that, you know, he's talking about, you know, groups that are currently stateless, that, you know, that groups that don't have, you know, not necessarily stateless in the sense that Palestinians are stateless. In some cases, these are groups that's like people are citizens of other states, but, you know, groups that aren't currently the majority in any nation state that exists, right? They don't have nation states of their own. And you say, well, it's clearly not racism to say that they shouldn't have nation states, but, you know, to me, and that's obviously correct, but I mean, to me, it's even more powerful to say, it's like, look, if, you know, if somebody says, oh my God, if we don't stop letting in all immigrants tomorrow, then, you know, in however many years, Canada will be majority minority. We clearly can't allow that because that would violate the right of, you know, white Canadians to self-determination, right? It's like, we clearly wouldn't think you were an anti-white racist for disagreeing with that. And I think that's actually a closer analogy than all this stuff about the Kurds and the Scots.
Let's reset that clock, and Natasha Hausdorff will have your rebuttal now.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I'd like to use my time to do some fact checking, but I only have 3 minutes, so we'll see how far I get. But first of all, Balfour. We heard him quoted to you earlier, ladies and gentlemen. Well, let's be clear about that quote and what was changed, or at least misrepresented, because I think this is going to give a really strong indication for what is coming out of the opposition as a whole. We were told he'd referred to Jews as alien and hostile. In fact, that he was therefore an anti-Semite. Well, I'm going to read you out the quote, and you make up your own minds. He said, mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or absorb. So I encourage you very strongly not to take for granted what the opposition are telling you tonight. And now we come to look at the numbers, and we've heard 37 and 38,000 quoted at you already this evening, and we've only just started. Ladies and gentlemen, would members of the opposition be quoting figures from Al-Qaeda or ISIS in the way that they are quoting Hamas propaganda here this evening? These figures, which have not been verified, and which even the UN has revised down on the basis of missing information for significant thousands of these figures that have come from quote-unquote media sources as opposed to from hospitals, and that have been circulated on Google Docs where people are encouraged to enter their martyrs here. This is the methodology for compiling these supposed figures. But even if we look past that and all of the studies that have already debunked these as significantly fabricated and invented, these figures make no distinction between civilians or combatants. They do not tell you how these people have died. We know that Hamas are shooting their own civilians. We know that they are bombing fleeing civilians. We know that when Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas rockets fall short in the Gaza Strip, they kill indiscriminately, unlike the measures that Israel takes, which are targeted, precise, and based on proportionality exercises. I mentioned that Israel takes more measures than any other army in the history of war to prevent civilian casualties. Hamas's main aim here is to drive up that casualty figure and inflate it, if necessary, in order to seek to win this war through creating international pressure. And it is inextricably linked with what we are discussing here tonight, because their mechanism for doing so is not just the lies about the origins of anti-Semitism or whether Balfour was an anti-Semite, but also significantly about what is happening on the ground. That is anti-Zionism, and it is double standard against the Jewish state, which means that we know that it is anti-Semitism too.
Okay, if none of the other people point out, like, someone needs to say a bunch of the stuff you're saying has nothing to do with the proposition. Like, because like she again spent 75% of what she was talking about saying stuff that has nothing to do with what they're there to debate, and it's driving me crazy.
Yeah. So the thing about Hamas numbers has already been addressed. Again, Gaza Ministry of Health figures have been borne out after previous wars. It's very likely it's an undercount now. And you know, it's the idea that doctors in Gaza, you know, are Hamas because, you know, Hamas controlled the government, you know, like previous, it's silly. It doesn't make any sense. The moment the most, I obviously agree with you on the larger point, Victor, but the moment that most offended me about this was when she read off the crazily anti-Semitic quote from Balfour to prove that he wasn't an anti-Semite, because like the way the word's been plucked from it, you know, like slightly misleading. It's like, yeah, it was actually slightly misleading, but also you read the whole quote. That's a crazily anti-Semitic quote. And the hall is clapping for that. It's like that was being treated like she just made a devastating. I mean, I'm sorry. I know this is like not a reference a lot of people are going to love just because of the way that the sort of subcultural whatever of this goes, but it's all I could think about was that Rick and Morty episode, you know, where your boos mean nothing to me. I've seen what makes you people clap.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's
the audience is a bit disturbing me. My fellow Torontonians, I'm a little bit stunned.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is a Munk debate crowd, and that's a specific kind of crowd. So in a way, maybe I'm not that surprised.
Fair enough. But then, like, to go back to your point, though, like the end of that was actually, I think that was like that was in a way the most ridiculous part, when she's like, so, okay, she says that Israel takes extraordinary measures, more measures than anybody else does to minimize civilian casualties. Complete bullshit, by the way. Has nothing to do with anything, but it is complete bullshit. The closer would be like the opposite would be much closer to the truth. That I mean, certainly when you're doing, like, you're using an app called Where Is Daddy to like to blow up targets when they're in their apartments with their families, then, you know, you're clearly not taking extraordinarily measures. And then, you know, the number, like the numbers certainly tell a story that, in fact, like the United States, which, you know, I think committed tons of war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, I spent a lot of my early 20s protesting those wars. Nothing that's happened since then has made me think I was wrong about that, right? But the United States wasn't anything like as indiscriminate as Israel has been in Gaza, in Iraq or Afghanistan. Not even close. I mean, look at the numbers for how many people died in all of Iraq in 2003 versus in the Gaza Strip with a tiny fraction of that population, you know, over the course of the last year. Or, Russia, right? Like Russia's war in Ukraine, they have been correctly slammed throughout the world for their many violations of the laws of war. I know there's a section of the chat that's going to disagree with me about that. I find that gross and disturbing, right? Like the way that some people on the online left sort of managed to somehow ideologically jujitsu themselves into supporting, Russian imperialism of all things, right? But like, Russia has been widely denounced for violating the laws of war and the way that it's bombed Ukraine. But like, Ukraine, despite having many, many, many times the population of Gaza, has had a tiny fraction of the number of civilians die in all of Ukraine that have died in years of war that have died in Gaza in the last year. So like, her claim could not be more out to lunch here, right? Like the factual claim is just completely deranged. But also, forget that. Like, just look at the inference and the last thing she said at the end there. That therefore you're applying a double standard to Israel, which is anti-Semitic. It's like this crazy logical leap at that last sentence. It's like, you could be applying a double standard to Israel. It doesn't mean you're doing it because of anti-Semitism. I mean, that's such a crazy thing. Like, again, if we were talking about, I don't know, like if we were talking about the Soviet war in Afghanistan in the 80s, right? Like, there were lots of people in the West who would go on and on about like the war crimes that were committed by the Red Army in Afghanistan. I'm sure lots of those people were engaged in double standards, right? That they were using much harsher standards to condemn Soviet bombing of Afghanistan than they did, like, for example, 10 years earlier for U.S. bombing in Vietnam. But that doesn't mean they were anti-Russian racists. Like, it's, even if it were true that there's an anti-Israel double standard, which is absolutely not, right? It's I think by and large, Israel benefits from double standards in Western discourse. But like, even if it were true, there's an anti-Israel double standard, like, the logical leap from there's a double like to therefore anti-Semitism is insane.
It's classic. It's
Yeah.
like it's like Uncle Leo logic, if you know that reference.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
It was also kind of funny, like the Balfour point. Like, yeah, like one is that the full quote just was anti-Semitic, and this is kind of this is kind of like a pedantic, maybe like analytic philosophy bro point. And to be fair to her, like the conceptual point could have been made without that particular example. So I guess it's fine of her to attack the example. But like, let's say that like she's right, and Balfour didn't actually say that, and so he's not actually anti-Semitic. It's like, okay, imagine like a possible world where he did say that verbatim and where he was anti-Semitic. Like, surely the fact that he supported the creation of the Jewish state wouldn't thereby preclude him from actually being anti-Semitic in virtue of those statements and so on. And like, surely that's the point, the fundamental point that was being made.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that the quote itself was extremely anti-Semitic. That we've been unable to either absorb or expel the Jews. Yeah. Right, this real problem, right? It's like, yeah, I mean, you're saying, these people are too different, they won't assimilate, right? I mean, that's what you're saying, right? Like, it's an anti-Semitic and just kind of anti-multicultural statement, right? That's like, you're just assuming that it's a problem if countries aren't culturally homogenous. So yeah, I think the statement itself was really anti-Semitic, but also, like, yeah, she's being incredibly dishonest in her implication. I mean, just quick search, right, gets you an article in the forward called "It's Time to Admit That Arthur Balfour Was a White Supremacist and an Anti-Semite Too," and you'll see in that they don't restrict themselves to that quote, right? They say in 1905, while serving as prime minister, Balfour presided over the passage of the Aliens Act. The legislation put forward the first restrictions on immigration into Great Britain, and was primarily aimed at restricting Jewish immigration. According to historians, Balfour had personally delivered passionate speeches about the imperative to restrict the wave of Jews fleeing the Russian Empire from entering Britain. So, I'd say there's like fairly substantial evidence for his anti-Semitism, even apart from the very anti-Semitic quote that she read.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. It's 10 minutes after. So normally, if we had like half an hour left, we'd be going to a post game. But we have 49 minutes almost left. So
More than that, more than an hour left. I think we're 49 minutes in.
Oh, you're right. I was misreading that. Yeah, we have a little over an hour left. So we're clearly not finishing tonight. We talked before we started about how if we end up in this situation, we'd finish it up in 2 weeks. So if we're going to do that, I guess my instinct is to skip the post game tonight, since if we did the post game, we would maybe get it down to this like awkward half hour that we had left.
Yeah.
Whereas I think what's left probably gets us like a somewhat normal show week after next
time, probably.
What's that?
Plus a post game next time, probably.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay. So that makes sense. So let's do that. So we will call it a night for tonight and resume. Resume the anti-Semitism in 2 weeks.
Continue the anti-Semitism.
Exactly. All right. Good night, guys. Left is best.